Okay, so it looks like there was a lot of interest about how to handle imports, especially with our recent pop-up events. And the first thing that I would recommend when handling an import is to realize that that's what you have. So obviously, if you import directly from the company, you're going to know that. It's going to show up on your doorstep. But sometimes at pop-up events, even sometimes at nurseries, there are times when plants are being sold directly by the import company, and they're brand spanking new. Even at pop-ups, those plants have not been acclimated. They literally are shipped to the city and picked up by whoever's hosting the pop-up, and then they're put out. So there's no acclimating happening. And these plants are coming from, most of the time, at least the ones I import from, are from South America, and they're literally living their perfect life in their ideal conditions, and then they are taken out of their substrate, hosed down in chemicals, packed in moss, which I don't know if they pack it dry to prevent rot, but I know that every time I've gotten an import, it's very, very dry. So the plant hasn't had a lot of water. It's gone through whatever conditions it's been through on planes, trucks, etc., to get to your front door or to the pop-up. And so the plant is extremely stressed. It's been taken from totally ideal conditions to absolutely the worst possible conditions it could have. So they really need to be handled in a different way. And there's a reason why they're cheaper than if you just buy a healthy acclimated plant, because of all these reasons. And they're susceptible to root rot and leaf drop and all these things, to where you're going to have a decent percentage of them that are lost. And even of those that aren't lost, you're going to have to put a lot of extra care into getting them to a plant that's able to live in, a household in North America and be happy. Okay, so starting in on the steps, when you get an imported plant, if you import it yourself, you're going to get it in a big box. It's going to be packed in all kinds of, packing material and stuff. Generally, I've imported from both Equigenera and Tropicals. I think they both pack them exceedingly well to minimize damage to the plants. So you're going to have to, first of all, get all of that stuff off, the packing, whatever. If you buy it at a pop-up, then it may, obviously it'll be out of the box already, but it may or may not still have some of the plastic and stuff around it. A lot of times they're shipped either in a plastic bag with moss around the roots, or sometimes in a little plastic pot with moss around the roots and some saran wrap around the top to keep the moss in. But either way, the first thing that you need to do is get all of the moss off of the plant. I don't actually have a recent import. I have some that I'm going to show you that are a little farther down the way, but I don't have one that literally just walked in the door. But you're going to try to get all of that moss off of the roots as best as you can. Use your sprayer in your sink, whatever you can. And for multiple reasons. For one, if you leave moss on there, you're more prone to getting root rot if you put it in certain substances. And the other reason is that moss has been sprayed with really powerful chemicals. So in order to be imported into the United States, part of the whole phytosanitary process is that all of it has to be hosed down in chemicals to make sure that you're not, importing some rare Ecuadorian fungus or something like that that's going to then traumatize all of the plants in the US. So the moss itself has a lot of that chemicals on it, so you don't want it lingering on the roots. So the first step is to get rid of all of the moss. At that point, I usually, once I've got the moss off, I'll take the plant either into my shower or into my sink, depending on how big it is, and just completely rinse the whole thing. Rinse the leaves, rinse the roots, rinse the stems. Just try to get any kind of debris off of the plant. It minimizes the chance that pests are coming in, though my experience has been that that's low. Like I said, they're hosed down in a lot of chemicals to prevent that. So I just rinse the entire plant off, and then I put it in water. So I have a ton of these. You can get these, this is just a mason jar, but different sized vessels like these, you can get them at Walmart, you can get them at the dollar store in the vase section. But I have a ton of these. And the very first, this is all on day one, we're removing the the boxing, we're removing all of the moss, rinsing the entire plant, putting it in plain old water. I tend to just use tap water. I don't put any kind of Super Thrive or nutrients or anything like that. Some people use rainwater, distilled water, whatever. The downside with tap water is there are some harsher chemicals in them, but that's also an upside because those harsher chemicals are made to deter germ growth, and that's kind of what you're also trying to deter on the roots of these plants. So I use tap water. So you're just going to fill this up to however much you need to cover the roots and put the plant in it and just set it to rehydrate for at least 24 hours. So put it someplace with as high a humidity as you can get. Mine go, you can see behind me, it's my grow tent. So mine go in my grow tent. But anything, some people, if you just have a small amount of imports, you can use like a Tupperware. If you have a big one, like one of those big totes, anything you can do to keep it in 100% humidity and warm. Heat mat underneath it. You don't want it to be too warm, but you also, like, if you like to keep your house cool like I do, you don't want it sitting at like 65 degrees. So a warm place with 100% humidity, rehydrating the roots in water for at least 24 hours. That's day 1. Day 2, or sometimes day 3, day 4, depending on what your time frame is looking like. Ideally the next day though, or roughly 24 hours later, you're going to come back and you're going to reassess the plant. So you're going to take it out of the water, and at this point you really want to look it over, and obviously when you unbox it, if it's just blatantly rotted, you're going to know that, right? But at this point you really just want to, check all of the stems, see if there's stem rot anywhere, see if there's parts that you need to trim, and remove any organic debris that you can. So if there's extra little cataphyll sheets or anything like that, you want to get rid of that, because with imports, your biggest enemy is root rot. And for root rot to happen, you need 3 main things to happen. You have to have the germs. You have to have I guess it's 4 things. You have to have the germs. You have to have organic matter, so something for the germs to feed on, whether that's pieces of the plant, stuff that's in dirt, if you're using, a true soil. But you have to have organic matter, you have to have water, and you have to have a lack of oxygen. So these germs, they need organic material to feed on, they need water, and they need to not have a lot of oxygen because they're anaerobic germs that don't like to have oxygen. So in this part, our goal is to get rid of any organic debris on the plant that you can possibly find, okay? Old cataphyls. I'm going to show you this right here. So this is a very, very sad import. So this is a Cyranoi by Warocquinum from Tropicals that I went through this process with, but I didn't quite get it clean enough and get it trimmed enough, and it shows. But so if you can see on here, I use various different tools. You want to keep your tools clean, wipe them off with hydrogen peroxide or alcohol so that you're not spreading any kind of rot. But I use like a little, tweezers, a little ear cleaner thing or whatever. But you want to, as best as you can, try to clean off like all of this organic debris on here. Down, if you have any, like down here, I can tell that I've got mushy stem, so I'm gonna have to trim that off. So anything on your stem that's mushy, this is gonna have to be probably cut back quite a ways. You want to cut it off. The goal is to get rid of as much dead tissue as possible. So when you start feeling firm live tissue, you've probably gone far enough. Whenever I cut any kind of stems, even on a healthy plant or a non-import, I always rub the cut in charcoal dust. Just helps. It's antibacterial, and it also kind of helps to callus that spot over. So in this point, you're cleaning it off, you're removing any extra debris, and then we're going to start trimming the roots, which is where I failed with this plant, because you can see there are clearly dead roots that I did not trim enough of. All right, so for this, I'm going to put this guy away. And I'll show you, this is an example of a beautifully rerooted import in water. And in getting rid of the organic debris, this is a Anthurium magnificum. In getting rid of the debris, now generally when you get an import, its roots are not going to look like this. They're going to look shriveled and gross. But this one has a couple of bad little spots on it that I'll show you, because this is what you're looking to get rid of. So with an Anthurium, I generally get rid of any root that looks like it's squishy and dead. Like if you can see this brown guy, hold on. This brown guy in there. I don't know if you can see that. Come here. Get it out better for you. Oh, there's a good one. If you can see what that thing looks like right there. That has to go. Now, for an Anthurium, when I get a new one in, if it's little satellite roots, so you've got the main roots, right? And then you've got the roots coming off the roots. If its satellite roots look good, I will usually not pull them off, like this one. That one right there you can see is a dead one. That's different for a philodendron. So philodendrons don't ship nearly as well. They don't have nearly as thick roots. Generally for a philodendron, you're going to want to get rid of all of the satellite roots. So you get down to where you have nothing but these big fat main roots. All of these little guys, these little noodles coming off, they all have to go, because 9 times out of 10, they're going to die. And then they're just going to fuel your fire for root rot, because you've got dead organic matter in there. And that's one of the things the germs want in order to make root rot. So like I said, this guy's been rerooted, so he doesn't have a whole lot of bad ones, but that's what you're looking for. And most of the time with philodendrons, I take all of these off. I just leave the main roots and I let it reroot from there. Anthuriums are yes or no, depending on what those roots look like. If they look like these, I would leave them. These look like white, healthy, good roots. If they at all looked compromised or brown or squishy or anything like that, even if only a portion of them do, then I generally take all of the satellite roots off and just go down to the main roots and reroot from there. Because if some of them are looking squishy, you're probably going to lose most of them, and then you're going to be setting yourself up for root rot. All right, so after you've got all the debris cleaned off, you've got all of the dead roots cleaned off, you've got it as rinsed as you can, you're going to use one of your vessels and you're going to soak it in a hydrogen peroxide concoction, which I use. I make it up in a gallon like this, and it's 1 cup of hydrogen peroxide, and then fill the rest of it to the top with water. Again, I just use tap water because I like taking advantage of those chemicals. And then I we'll put this in it, fill it up. I'd like to give you a time, but I don't know, like somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes. I try to not forget about it and leave it in there for a long time, but I don't time it. Usually I move on to the next plant, and while I'm trimming off the roots and cleaning it up, then I come back to the first plant that was in the hydrogen peroxide bath. So yeah, somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes. Basically, you're just trying to kill off any, as much of any other bad bacteria that's in there as you can. When you take it out of the hydrogen peroxide bath, you want to get all of the hydrogen peroxide off of it. Doesn't matter if you want to stick it into another water bath, if you want to rinse it with your sink hose, whatever. Just don't forget to rinse it after the hydrogen peroxide, because that is, hurtful to the roots. You don't want it to stay on there. It'll eventually burn the roots. All right. So at this point, we've cleaned it up. We've gotten rid of all of the bad roots. We've gotten rid of any extra debris. We've soaked it in our hydrogen peroxide. We've rinsed it off. And now it's decision time. So if you have a plant, like let's say this one just came, okay? If you had a plant that looked like this, or even less satellite roots, but still it has good leaves. The leaves aren't dropping. The leaves aren't yellowing. It's got good main roots. It's even got some decent satellite roots. So your choices at this point are, Especially if it's an anthurium. Would not do this with a philodendron. Again, with philodendron, you want to go like the most cautious route because they just don't import well. So if this was what I had, I would consider putting this directly into a substrate. Now, I use pon, again, because that whole trifecta for root rot. So in pon, even though you have a very wet substrate, you don't have, at least in theory, if you've cleaned off all your yuck on here, you don't have any extra organic matter for the germs to use, and you have a ton of air because the rock is porous. So for me, I'm a big fan of pon for putting something like this. If you put it in soil, even a chunky soil, straight from like, we just got this, we just cleaned this up, you're going to put it in soil. I'm not saying I've never done it, and I'm not saying it won't ever work, but it's risky. You're really putting it at risk because you have a delicate situation right now where these roots need water. They've been very dehydrated in the shipping process. But if you sit them in water without oxygen and a lot of organic matter, like what the situation is in soil, then they're going to rot. So I wouldn't do that. I'd either put it in a semi-hydro setup, if this were a fresh import, or I would put it in moss or water or anything else if I feel like it needs to reroot a little bit. If I saw this right here, I would not think that it needs to reroot, so I would probably put it straight into pon. Now, what I just showed you is almost never, ever, ever what you're going to have at this point. What you're generally going to have is a plant that has you've had to strip usually some degree of roots off of. It may or may not also have some stem rot. It may or may not have leaves that are yellowing and dropping. So if I have all of that, but I still have good central roots, I've gotten rid of all the little side roots, but I still have good, strong central roots, then you're basically at this point just going to try and support the plant in rerooting. And you can do it different ways. I've had a lot of luck with water. So basically just the way it was the first 24 hours, you put it back in that and sit it in water. The thing with water is you pretty much have to change it every day. You can sometimes get away with every other day. But because in our little setup for root rot, when you first put fresh water in there, there's a lot of oxygen in the water. If you don't have any other way of oxygenating the water, like an air stone, and it's just sitting there, the plant is slowly going to use up all of the oxygen in the water. The oxygen is going to diffuse into the air, and you're going to end up with anaerobic wet environment. And so basically you've got to change the water every day and keep giving it fresh water so that there's no chance for it to get really anaerobic and gross in there. I've had a lot of luck rerooting plants in water. You just have to change it regularly or have an air stone. So it's not always the most time efficient way to do it. Another way that I like to do it is something I call the parfait. So this is one that's in a parfait. This is a plant, this is a big Narangatense. And this plant had great central roots. I had to strip off all of the satellite roots, but it had great central roots. The plant itself was looking strong. It didn't have any leaf yellowing. It wasn't looking dried up. It looked pretty good, right? But it just needed a chance to reroot. And I knew that I was going to be traveling some and not able to deal with changing water every day. So I put it in what I call the sandwich method. This is basically just different semi-hydro ingredients with a wick that goes to the bottom. So I have leca on the bottom. Then I generally put a layer of very coarse, chunky perlite. Then some pon, some more perlite, and some leca on top. And so basically we're just trying to give this thing some stability and some moisture. I fill it up the very bottom with water, and like I said, it's got a wick so that it can go up to the higher layers. We're basically just trying to give this guy some structural support and some moisture and some time to just grow nice roots through there. So I do that. You can see, I don't know if you can see it right there, but there's, there you can see the little red roots. So this one's starting to grow new roots. I also tend to put a little bit of cling wrap over top, not completely covering it, because like I said, you want air in there. You want the oxygen to get in there, but I'm just trying to manage my plant chore time, and these will, especially if you have them in a hot grow tent, they'll dry out really quickly, and you don't want the water too high, so you're constantly trying to keep this little level. So I will put some cling wrap around the top. And then the third way, and I pick these ways depending on just the plant, how I feel like I've had experience that it will do well in this substrate, and what kind of time I have. Like I said, I think philodendrons do outstanding with water rerooting, but I don't always have time to give them the attention they need for that. So this one, this is a philodendron heterocraspidum, and this guy had obviously beautiful leaves. This is the top portion of the plant, so it's got a new leaf coming in, but I had to completely clear cut its roots. It had no good roots left. So now I put it in just some slightly damp moss. Again, I put this over top because I can't be dealing with dried out moss every 2 seconds. And you can see it's already starting to send a root through there. So basically, if you've got good central roots and you've got some decent leaves, you can choose your way to reroot it, but it needs rerooted. If you try to put a plant that has no roots, or very little working good roots straight into substrate, it's not going to work very often. And here's a perfect example. So the top portion, or the bottom portion of this plant, this is the same plant. Sad, not sad. So this is a bottom portion of the plant, and when I cut it, both nodes had some roots. The roots on this node looked pretty good. The roots on this node looked pretty bad, so I cut them completely and I put it in the rerooting process. This one I took a chance on and was like, oh, well, it's got some roots, it'll be okay. So I put it straight into pond, and as you can see, those roots shriveled up and died. And now I've actually even got a little bit of rot there. The stem's pretty much dead. So yeah, didn't work for that. A lot of times when I get a plant, if there's multiple viable sections of the plant, I will cut them, just not only for propagation's sake, but just because then I have more than one attempt at getting a final product that lives. So this one is going to go into the last category. So the last category is if you end up where you have really no viable roots, you have really no viable leaves, nothing that's going to be giving this plant any kind of energy, then what you basically got is a wet stick. And at this point, I would pull all these roots off, clean this up, take the leaves off, and it will go... Okay, so when we get to that point, this is a queen that I had. Just a side note, queens import badly. Not saying I've never gotten one where I had some salvageable roots and salvageable leaves. Just saying it doesn't happen very often. So this is a queen chunk. Just actually started to put out a little root there. But this was one that, like I said, was worst case scenario. Well, not quite worst. Worst case scenario is the whole thing's a rotted piece of mush. But second worst case scenario, where I've got no viable roots, I've got no viable leaves, I've basically just got a chunk. And for me, there's different things. This guy I decided to put in some moss, and put on a heating pad in my grow tent. Just to let it reroot, and this will probably take a long time. It's another reason why imports are a gamble. Not saying you won't get the plant that you wanted, but it may take a lot longer than you thought. So here's a perfect example. This is an import, an Anthurium crystallinum silver that was imported from Tropicals. And if you can see, it's got new growth coming in. It's given me this beautiful new leaf. And it just looks like an amazing stellar plant, right? It's got great roots. It's in pond. You can even, I don't know if you can see it, but there's actually some roots starting to poke in the bottom. This is the exact same plant, well, same, not the same specimen, but the same type of plant that was imported in the same load from the same place, and this is what I have. So if you can see, it was completely down to chunks. There was nothing, it had decent roots, but it had no. Yeah, so this guy is just chunks down in pond. I had to trim it back a lot because of root rot with a little moss around it, and this one has given me a growth point and a pretty new leaf. So it will eventually look like my other gorgeous specimen down there, but it's gonna be a long time from now. So you've decided what to put your plant in, how you're gonna reroot it. The next step of the process is really just reassessing the plant very often. So general rule of thumb in plants is don't mess with them, right? They don't want to have their environment changed. They don't want to have their substrate changed. They don't want to have their roots messed with. Well, if you do that with imports, you're going to end up with a lot of dead plants. Like, where'd she go? This sad boy. This one that I had put in pond probably would have been a lot more salvageable if I had checked on her daily after I did this, except I put her in the back of my grow tent, forgot about her. But I probably wouldn't have to be going to such a drastic point with this. I could maybe just get away with, you know, having some good leaves and rerooting it if I had assessed it much quicker and realized that this wasn't working for it. So if your import is going downhill quickly, change something. It's only going to continue to go downhill. It's not like a regular established plant that, like, oh, you give it some time, maybe move it a little bit, no, whatever. Like, you need to look at the roots. You need to basically go back to step one and see, do I need to trim this? Do I have stem rot? Do I need to get rid of more roots? Do I need to completely start with rerooting it? I try to constantly be on top of looking at my imports, and even the ones that I'm like, oh, this guy looks great, let me go ahead and put it down into substrate. The second it starts to look bad, if I'm paying attention, I'm pulling it out of there. It's another reason why I really like pond, because it's easy to get plants in and out of pond. You know, you don't have to really rinse off the roots. You pull it out and you can see right there. By the way, this is pond. It's just it has leca on top of it, but it's really easy to pull it out and see what's going on. I even sometimes I don't think I have it right here, but I have like clear inserts that I use so that I can actually like see what's going on with the roots with an import, because they can really tank really quickly, and if you don't intervene quickly, then you're gonna either go back quite a few steps or lose the plant. I think that's it. Generally, everything that I've said, like kind of going in the opposite direction, is what you do when a plant's doing well. So let's say you've decided to root it in water or moss or whatever, and now we've got something like this. Think, you know, thick noodle roots. Now you can move it basically to the next step and put it in whatever substrate you use. Again, I like pond, especially if you water root it, because basically the same type of roots that it needs to be in pond are essentially water roots. So if you've water rooted a plant, putting it into pond, for me, it goes a lot more smoothly than putting it into a much less aerobic environment like soil. So the story of this plant is it was re-rooted in water. Once it had not this many roots, but some nice strong roots, it was put in pond, and it was left in pond 2-3 months, I think, until it was putting out new growth. It didn't have any yellowing of the leaves. Like, it just was looking like a thriving, happy plant. And then my final step If I'm going to sell the plant, sometimes, since not everyone is familiar with pond, a lot of times I will repot it into a nice chunky soil and make sure that it's still doing well in the chunky soil, just because that's what more people use and are familiar with. But if I'm going to keep it for myself, I generally just keep it in pond. Yeah, that's all I've got to say about the process. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, just hit me up on the group. All right, bye.